This is Episode 1, Deep Dawn, The Origin of the Jews. History of the Jews. What was I thinking? It's a huge minefield to begin with. Jews are definitely the most disputed, not to say hated groups of people on Earth. According to the ADL, Anti-Defamation League Index, a staggering number of more than 1 billion people across the world that are 26% of the population in the 101 countries that were surveyed share anti-Semitic views. I guess that most of them never met an actual Jew, nor actually talked with one to begin with. And I also guess that if the state of Israel will be the subject of this survey, those numbers might be even higher. Now, I think that hating someone just because of her or his ethnic or religious background is ridiculous and absolutely flawed. Yet, it is also amazing that a quarter of the world dislikes Jews, considering that, as of 2023, there are barely 15 million of them worldwide, which is less than 0.2% of the total world population, or 1.5% of those who hate them. Hatred of Jews, and on the other side, their almost total admiration by many others, are only two of the mysteries that are deeply tied to their historical roots. Similar mysteries are the ability of this small, stubborn people to survive long-lasting harassments, exiles, repeated attempts of genocide. Some of them were unfortunately partly successful, and on the other side, keep their complex tradition and gain impressive achievements like reviving their unspoken, almost forgotten language. Much of the Jews' bad relations are heavily connected to certain key events in the far and close history of the Jews. In time, those events have grown into deep religious and national conflicts. So put aside your prejudice or a priori beliefs about the Jews if you have some, and stay with me as we shade some light to this matter. At this point, I realize I owe you a few words of context, so I'll put it straight right here. I was born and raised in a small village in front of the Gilead, the mountainous region in northern Transjordan, not far from the Jordan River, and I am doing this podcast as an effort to understand a little bit more about my cultural heritage and past. I am an Israeli scholar Jew. Now, while each element of this three adjectives combo might be explosive to some, please rest assured that I will do my best to stick to the contemporary evidence-based research as I manage to understand it, base claims I mention on supporting facts as presented in contemporary research, and when I can, and turn your attention to criticism and different points of view when the time comes. I also expect and ask that comments you may want to share will be strictly to the matter and rely as possible on evidence. This podcast is not a political manifesto and cannot be seen as a professional academic project since I don't have the right formal academic education in this field. It expresses my own views only on certain historical events as I see them. And in case the one or two persons who bothered to listen to this podcast hold monotheistic religious beliefs of any kind, I must clarify that this podcast relies on the critical approach in biblical studies and related fields. That means the discussion here will not be stemming from the axiom that accepts biblical narrative as a divine absolute truth, but rather on judging the biblical narrative according to the existing evidence and academic knowledge. If you are okay with all of that, we can begin. In this episode, we are starting from scratch, from the very origin of the Jews as a people. I must warn you that this subject is fuzzy. With the absence of information about this period, most research today jumps straight to the settlement period of Israel and Judah and places their formation as an entity, as a settler people, or as a state. One of the next episodes will be devoted to this period, but for the time being, we will be focusing in this episode mostly on the processes and events before that. One last comment. I chose to use the original names of places and peoples at the time the mentioned events had occurred, or at least widely used terms the literature gives them. In the cases of the Jewish people and the land of Israel, it requires a special clarification. Most scholars see contemporary Judaism as very different from the religion of the ancient Jews, so they don't consider the name Jews appropriate but rather call the ancient Jews Israelites. Accordingly, I adopted this term for the Jews in all episodes until the Second Temple period. As for the land of Israel, things are getting a little more complicated due to contemporary conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. To the region between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan, I will call the land of Canaan, but later in the period of settlement I will refer to it with the biblical word of land of Israel, and later on it will be turned into the kingdoms of Israel and Judea. You should be aware also that in any place I mention the Bible, I mean the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament alone. The New Testament will become later in case I will be able to proceed with this pod long enough, as it is a more recent creation probably from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Setting the background. What makes a group of human beings a people? Apart from being larger in number than, let's say, an extended family, they must share a common cultural capital, a narrated history, real or mythical ancestry, language maybe, customs and traditions and common territory. But above all that, they have to see themselves as a distinct group of people. It seems obvious that the Jews fit very well into this a people definition. Yet, as with everything related to the Jews, there are disagreements even about this very basic fact. A common Palestinian viewpoint sees Judaism, for obvious reasons, merely as a religion or a religious community, not a nation. By this claim, they challenge the legitimacy of the Zionist movement and its monometallic project of the State of Israel. We will get to that much later on. Some postmodern critics have raised similar claims on different grounds, carried out in a reckless atmosphere of limitless intellectual freedom. Take, for example, Shlomo Zend, a well-known Israeli professor. Let me pause a bit here to note the surprising fact that many of the most prominent and harshest critics of the standard narrative of Jewish history, of Zionism, and of the State of Israel are actually Jews themselves, and some are Israelis. Zend is just the first of them to be mentioned in this podcast. Zenid is a new historian, an idiom that refers in the Israeli academia to scholars that challenge the very historical and cultural narrative of, for Israelis, the imagined community that is the State of Israel. Some 15 years ago, he published a super controversial book called The Invention of the Jewish People, claiming that the Jewish people is a modern creation constructed by the Zionist leadership and recruited scholars for instrumental reasons. He based this claim on several unrelated grounds: flaws in the Bible, historical narrative, and inconsistencies with the archaeological evidence that wrongly led him to dismiss this source altogether. Mass waves of conversion and absorption of neighboring people into Judaism, mainly in the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman periods, led him to believe that the Jews are a loose coalition of people with no real common ethnic ground. And finally, Zenid continues, the Jews did not forcefully exiled, but rather willingly migrated out of the land of Israel in large numbers beginning at the First Temple period. For those reasons, he rejects the existence of the Jewish people as a real people, claiming that it is a new invention made by the avant-garde group of Zionist leadership to organize and drive those who hold the Judaism religion into action for solving the security and identity crises the modern period have brought upon the Jews. Now, Jews, evangelists, and other supporters out there, please relax. Before you switch to another podcast, you should be aware that Zend got it all wrong. Like many other postmodernists, his analysis is a mixture of cherry-picking of convenient facts together with some significant exaggerations and off-context questionable commentary. Let alone the obvious notion that if you are a large group of people that see themselves as a distinct people, you are a people, what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities. His claims are questionable to say the least. The current evidence points out that the Jewish people in its ancient form, the Israelites and Judeans, did live in the land of Israel and had a distinct language, writing system, and religious beliefs. And although their religious practices and beliefs did change greatly over the years, the essence components of them, like the deity Jehovah, the belief in the Egypt Exodus, circumcision, and the avoidance of pork, persisted for 3,000 years to this day. So, why am I bothering you with this stuff here? I am doing it because the very same characteristic that defines the Jews as a people can help us trace their origin. I am talking about diving to the very beginning of their common history, as well as tracing the origin of the Hebrew language, looking for clues for ancestors provided by ancient genetic studies, and following the roots of ancient Israelite culture and customs as explored by modern biblical studies. By triangulating all this, at the end of this episode, we might have some interesting insights on the origin of the Jews. However, please don't hold your breath. We won't have definitive answers to this mystic issue. We will have to settle with some hypothetical suggestions to the question where the Jews originally came from. Jewish origin according to the historical records, the Hebrew Bible. I guess that at this point some of you may think I am joking. We have the Hebrew Bible, you might rightly say, which I will simply call it from now on the Bible, a direct and relatively coherent source about the history of the ancient Jews or the Israelites. So, can we use the Bible as an accountable historical source? The next episode of this podcast is going to be dedicated to this question. For now, I will just say rather briefly that between a full rejection of the biblical historical narrative and almost full acceptance of it as historical truth, you can find most scholars somewhere in the middle of this sequence, often with some tendency towards one of the two poles. The ones that tend towards the rejection pole point doubt the credibility of the biblical source due to the absence of other direct sources, believe that it was written hundreds of years after the events due to some temporal mismatches between the biblical events and the archaeological findings and to late influences, in the Babylonian exile period and the Persian and Hellenistic period mainly, and see the Bible as a political and religious text that invent and twist historical events accordingly. From the other side, the Bible is a very bright historical source that provides us with a reasonably clear timeline of a breathtaking long period of about 12 to 15 centuries. Second, in its remarkably poetic yet detached narrative, it weaves a chain of detailed stories with heroes, dates, places, figures, customs, and events into an historical reality. And third, let alone that most of the time it is the only thing we've got. It is the sole direct source on ancient Jewish history. We can assume that it preserves some historical truth to some degree, maybe a considerable degree. And this what I think that lays in the root of this sequence, some realization of the half-empty, half-full glass dilemma. If you are a full half scholar, you probably will give more importance to the biblical narrative and try to seek proof for parts of it. And if you empty half one, you probably tend to dismiss it and see the absence of proof as a proof that stands for itself. We will see in the final part of this episode an expression to this dilemma with two models for the emergence of the Israelites as people, each taking a different side of this issue. But for now, we will start our exploration about the origin of the Jews with the biblical version by examining a bit more closely the Abraham voyage story. Abraham, the traditional ancestor of the Jews. The early stories of Abraham are the earliest biblical record we can work with for exploring the question of Jewish origin. Yet I should warn you that, with lack of direct supportive evidence, they only provide faint shadows that may imply what happened. In fact, this situation will accompany us during the second millennium BCE, from 1800 BCE, when presumably had Abraham lived, right to the first external evidence for a biblical event that is the campaign of Pharaoh Shoshenq around 926 BCE, mentioned in the Bible as Shishak. What that means is that for the early periods of the Patriarchs, the Egypt Exodus, the conquest of Israel by Jusha, the Judges, and even what is termed the United Kingdom of Israel, meaning the days of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon are all lacking the smoking gun proving once and for all their existence. Yet before you leave this podcast disappointed, it should be added that there is plenty of indirect evidence that supports the biblical narrative, or at least some crucial parts of it. In fact, the indirect evidence is getting richer and plantier during this millennium as you look at later periods. The faint shadows implying biblical awareness to the historical realia during the patriarch's time will become much more figurative and concrete later on in the Exodus, settlement, and United Kingdom periods. What that means is that there might be grain of truth in the early biblical stories. They seem to be more than the canonical myths. Scholars struggle on where to draw the line between legend and historical truth throughout all this millennium, as you should too. I cannot give you a definite answer. I can just point your view to the evidence and let you decide its meaning. It seems that Abraham's journey to the land of Israel is the earliest biblical record that might tell us something about the origin of the Jews. The biblical text mentions two places in ancient Mesopotamia. Abraham and his family had moved from Ur-Kasdim towards Canaan but settled in Haran. The city of Haran even today is called by that name. It sits in southeastern Turkey, 16 kilometers north of the Turkish-Syrian border. The city is well documented in cuneiform documents, both in the Abelian language and in Akkadian. It is mentioned as early as the 3rd millennium BC, and other mentions of the city also return in the 2nd and 1st millennium BC. So, it can be assumed it is a real place that in Abraham's estimated time was a well-established city. And what about Ur of the Chaldees, Ur-Kasdim? Ur of the Chaldees is often associated with the great city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, in the site of Tel al-Mukyar in southern Iraq, which flourished mainly during the Sumerian period. This identification was made widely recognized by Sir Leonard Woolley, 1880–1960, who excavated the site for 12 years, 1922 to 1934. Woolley discovered one of the largest cities in the ancient world, including the large portable ziggurat, wonderful gold objects, and thousands of cuneiform documents. In the spirit of the times and the prevailing practice of trying to find biblical traces, Woolley assumed that the size and importance of the Sumerian city of Ur is evidenced by about 1,000 witnesses that Abraham was actually born there. Ur of the Chaldees. Yet this identification of Ur suffers from several issues, summarized by Professor Gary Rensburg. A reference in Joshua 24:2 says that Terah, Abraham's father, was living across the river, and from there he and Abraham had gone towards Canaan. Rensburg tells us that the meaning of the expression across the river in the Bible without additional details is to the Euphrates River, but the Sumerian Ur is located on the western bank of the Euphrates River and not beyond this river in relation to the land of Israel. Haran is not located on the ancient ways from Ur to Canaan. The ancient trade routes in this area followed the geography of the Fertile Crescent, up towards northwest, along the Euphrates River, and then west in Mary and Tadmor to Damascus, or through a further northern route towards today's Asad Lake and southwest to Damascus, where the access to Canaan was relatively short and easy. Yet Terah and his family continued northwest towards Haran out of the obvious way towards Canaan Joji. Ur is mentioned as Ur-Chasidim, that is, Ur of the Chaldeans. We know a lot about the Chaldeans by Assyrian records. However, the earliest mentions of them are dated to the 9th century BC approximately, and they seem to migrate to southern Mesopotamia, where Ur is located somewhere in the 8 centuries BC, 1,000 years after the estimated time of Abraham. That poses a serious credibility problem for the biblical story. It may imply that it was written a long time after the happenings and therefore is lacking a real historical context. One explanation that can settle this issue is that the mentioning of the Chaldeans in this story is a latter addition pointing to the readers in 6th century BC, where Ur was located, by reference to the name they knew this place at their time. Alternatively, the American researcher Cyrus H. Gordon, who excavated Ur in the 1930s together with Woolley, but disputed his identification of Ur, claiming that, geographically speaking, if Terah and his family left Ur-Kasdim for Canaan and on their way camped in Haran, Ur-Kasdim must be located north of Haran and not far to the southeast of Haran. Abraham's family must have went from north to southwest along the inhabited areas of the western Levant. According to this assumption, the more plausible possibility is that Abraham's hometown is Ur in northern Mesopotamia, today Urpa or Sanliurfa in southeastern Turkey, about 44 kilometers north of Haran. Rendsburg supports this theory by claiming that Caledonians originated from the Caucasus in the area that includes Urpa and Haran. He based his claim on the writing of Xenophon, 431–354 BC, an ancient Greek historian who mentioned the Chaldeans had lived in this area and were the neighbors and adversaries of the Armenians, and also points out that their name was preserved over time in this area today in the name of the Chaldean Catholic Church, whose believers live in the area. However, it is worth to note that Rendsburg's claim stands on shaky ground. Xenophon writings are dated hundreds of years after the biblical story. There is no concurrent written evidence for the existence of the Caledonians in the time of Abraham in this region. Rendsburg adds some indirect support for the alternative identification of Ur as Urpa. He claims that Urpa is probably the city of Ura in documents originating from Ugrit, 14th and 13th century BC, and associated with the Hittite kingdom, and also this location was preserved in local traditions, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim as for the biblical Ur from where Abraham was originated. Also the names of two of Abraham's ancestors mentioned in the biblical story, Nahor, Abraham's grandfather, and Serug, his great-grandfather, were preserved in this area as names of places. Nahor is a place known from Akkadian sources to be existed in Upper Mesopotamia, even if its exact location is unknown. Serug is a city known from Aramaic Syrian sources, and whose name has been preserved in the name of the contemporary Turkish city of Surus, pronounced Sirek, and in Syrian Aramaic Seruj, which sits about 46 kilometers southwest of Urpa. With the Bible as a sole source of information, we will not be able to confirm Abraham's existence and origin, probably never. Yet we can say we have a biblical tradition that in some way represents the self-memory of the ancient Israelites, which places their origin in the northern corner of the Fertile Crescent. The reference to northern Syria or Upper Mesopotamia as Abraham's place of origin is repeated in the Bible few times later on. Genesis 24 tells us that Abraham sent his slave to his homeland for finding a mate to his son Isaac. "I want you to swear by the Lord that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." And then we are told that the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. There he found Rebekah, who eventually went with him back to Canaan and married Isaac. Similarly, in Genesis 28, Isaac is telling Jacob, "Do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Paddan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself there." Paddan is translated in Hittite as a field of Aram, and the term Paddan Aram Kab be one of the ancient names of the area of the city of Harn. Then, after 3 verses, we are told that Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Although we cannot confirm Abraham's journey to Canaan or his existence at all, this story or tradition might echo a collective memory shared by some ancient Israelites about their origin, and this collective memory is bounded by actual reality at the presumed time of Abraham, the places. It is worth adding something about the domestication of the camel in this respect. In the Paryakas, stories mention the camel as a domesticated beast several times, one of them cited above in the story of Abraham's slave bringing Rebekah. Some archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein claimed based on archaeological evidences from the 1960s and 1970s that the domestication of the camel occurred at the first centuries of the first millennium BCE, much later than the alleged time of Abraham, and that this asynchronous detail indicates that the patriarch stories were written hundreds of years after the time of the events, and therefore are not trustworthy. However, today we have evidence for camel domestication in the 2 and 4 millennium BCE, for example, camel bones, dung, and fibers discovered in sites like Shar-e-Sokhta in Iran, dating back to the early 3rd millennium BCE. Depictions of camels in ancient art, such as those found in Mesopotamia and Egypt, suggest that camels were known and used in these regions by the 2nd millennium BCE, and records in the Alalakh document discovered in modern-day southern Turkey, not very far from Haran, that provide evidence of camel trade and usage in the region around the 17th century BCE. Historical perspective on the question of Israelite origin. So, what does the Bible tell us about the origin of the Israelites? We can learn that Israelites are not the native inhabitants of Canaan. Those were the Canaanites that ceased to exist 2.5 millennia ago, but rather came to Canaan from somewhere else, probably northwestern Mesopotamia. We also being told about a long process of generation, from an extended family during Abraham's younger years and journey to Canaan, into a tribe during the life of the patriarchs in Canaan, and then to a chiefdom with centralized authority in the time Moses and Joshua, and a kingdom with social institutions, central government, and fortified cities in the time of David and Solomon. This process has a consistent chronological timeline across hundreds of years, and is very much in line with the primordialist theory of anthropologists Schills and Gertz that see natural evolution of pre-existing ethnic groups over time. According to this aging anthropological theory, peoples and nations emerge naturally out of long-standing ethnic groups that are bound by shared ancestry, culture, and language, and eventually form cohesive political entities as historical conditions allow. Those kinship networks, shared myths of origin, and collective memory are viewed as foundational in binding people together and maintaining a sense of group identity over generations. So what is the problem with this biblical view? Well, we don't have a smoking gun. We can't prove it or disprove it, since the evidence, mainly in the earlier stages of this process, is pretty scarce. We only have faint clues, pieces of realia, detailing, and some narrative analysis that may indicate that the patriarch stories are deep communal memories of true events. However, we will not be able to prove or disprove this narrative. The earliest and most well-known reference to the existence of the Israelites comes from the Merneptah stele, dated to around 1207 BCE, that was discovered in Thebes, modern Luxor, Egypt, and inscribed by Pharaoh Merneptah, the son of Ramses II. The stele was written in hieroglyphics on a 200 by 60 centimeters black granite stone and commemorates Merneptah's military successes. While the majority of the text focuses on his defeat of the Libyans, the last few lines describe his victories in Canaan, where he lists several cities and peoples he claims to have subdued. According to this account, the Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam was made non-existent. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. This is the earliest non-biblical mention of Israel as a distinct group of people. Unlike other places mentioned in the stele, like Ashkelon and Gezer, Israel is not referred to as a city or territory, but rather as a people or tribe. The hieroglyphs that accompany the name Israel use a determinative sign indicating that it was referring to a people rather than a settled city-state or geographic location. The phrase, "its seed is no more," has been interpreted by scholars as a typical boast of total conquest or devastation, but it does not necessarily imply the literal extermination of the Israelites. It could mean that Merneptah believed he had defeated and subjugated this group, reducing its power. Other than that, some scholars pointed to the similarity in pronunciation of one of the biblical names of the Israelites, Hebrews, in Hebrew, Ivriim, Brim, and the term Habiru, or Apiru, that was used, thought the ancient Levant, Mesopotamia, and Egypt for a social class of foreign people, often semi-nomadic in the outskirts of urban society, and who were low-class workers, outlaws, or dispossessed peoples. They were sometimes employed as mercenaries or were known as rebels. The Habiru are frequently mentioned in the El Amarna archive, a collection of letters written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of their time, on clay tablets that was discovered in Amarna, Egypt, in the late 19th century. Those tablets are a correspondence between the cities of the region, including cities in Greater Canaan with the Egyptian pharaohs of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun during the 14th century BCE. In this correspondence, the Habiru are mentioned there as a serious threat to the stability of the late Bronze Canaanite city-states. The early Israelites, at least according to the biblical accounts, might have shared some social characteristics with the Habiru, particularly in terms of their mobility and conflict with established powers in Canaan. However, this theory was questioned due to lack of evidence. Scholars generally agree that the Apiru and the Hebrews were not identical, though they are divided on whether there was any connection between them. Some firmly reject any link, arguing the groups were unrelated. Others suggest that the Hebrews may have been one subgroup of the broader, ethnically diverse Apiru, which included nomads, displaced peoples, and biblical groups like the Midianites and Kenites, leading to a common view that all or many of the original Israelites were Hebrews, Habiru, but not all Habiru were Israelites. What genetics and linguistic tells us? Are there other ways to deepen our understanding of Israelite origin? Well, yes. We can turn to two indirect ways that have recently helped historians to get a glimpse on the ancient roots of populations worldwide, to trace origin and movement of populations. Genetics, which means in this case study of ancient DNA, the Israelites, and language, which can refer in this case to linguistic evolution of the Hebrew language. The study of ancient DNA is a new science that has been advancing rapidly in the recent decades. Recall that each of us has a specific set of genetic material stored in 46 chromosomes by a compound molecule called DNA, and that we got approximately half of it from our mother and the second half from our father in an almost random mixture. What is not random, however, is the genetic material we got is almost identical to that our parents had in the time that we initially started our journey as embryos. I said almost identical because each one of us has on average 70 mutations in our genetics that we didn't get from our parents. Those facts mean three basic things. 1. Our DNA is relatively stable through time. We can trace the same sequences of genes inherited from generation to generation. 2. Yet there are differences due to mutations that are transferred to future generations as well. That means that different populations share distinct sequences of genes and can be used to identify them. 3. The DNA of people that are geographically close to us will be in most cases similar to us because most of us still find our mates in our familiar area. This tendency was of course stronger in ancient times before the car, aviation, and the global economy, but even then far from exclusive. It seems that there was always a mixture of genes between ethnic groups due to fortunate and less fortunate events. Sound simple? Well, you have to understand the magnitude of the task. Researchers in this field have to identify genetic markers that are combinations of nucleotide pairs, which are the building blocks of our DNA. Of approximately 3 billion nucleotide pairs that form the human genome, only 35 million are different from the corresponding nucleotides of the chimpanzee genome, and about 90 million more are added. That together makes only 1.23% of our genome different from that of the chimpanzee. Likewise, it was found that at least when it comes to genetics, we humans are almost the same. Aside from those fan facts, the research of population genetics has to focus on the mere 0.20% of the human genome that is different between ethnic populations. If you already gave a sample of your DNA to one of the companies that analyzed it for you, today, it is a matter of $130, you may be aware that the study of population genetics has identified the genetic characteristics of thousands of ethnic populations worldwide. Most of our DNA is a hybrid mixture of what we get from our biological mother and father, but some sections of it we get from only 1% for certain. One of these sections is the mitochondrial DNA, which is the genetic material found in mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell that generate energy, and we inherit it only from our mother. Therefore, we can assume this DNA actually preserves attributes from a chain of ancestral mothers, and so we can use it to trace the origin of individuals and larger-scale populations. A massive scientific project began in 2002 and called the HapMap Project used mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA, its masculine counterpart, to classify the human genome into approximately 30 groups of mitochondrial DNA and several hundreds groups of Y-DNA. Those groups are called haplogroups, and each one of those have similar genetic markers, haplotypes, that share a common ancestor with a particular genetic mutation. Those groups were split over time at different points in time, in a multiple forks or a tree formation, so they are essentially different branches on the human genetic family tree. So with this data and with using other genetic markers and techniques, insights on genetic similarity and development can be established over time. In his book from 2012, Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People, Harry Osterer, a medical doctor and professor of genetics, concludes, based on 20 years of genetic research, that modern Jews have a shared genetic legacy. Based on studies of genetic-related disease, chromosomes, and blood groups, Osterer traces origins and relatedness of Jewish communities in different parts of the world, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews, and demonstrates that not only are the overwhelming majority of contemporary Jews are genetically related, but also that they descend from common Middle Eastern ancestors. In other words, empirical genetic testing provides robust support to the traditional narrative of Jewish history, in which the Jews originated from the Levant. Osterer's evidence-based findings profoundly reject anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist agenda-based assertions that contemporary Jews are not descended from the ancient Israelites. Yet, although interesting, this is not enough. For tracing an ancient population, we have to examine ancient genome, that is, ancient DNA of the Israelites who lived in Canaan during the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age, somewhat before 1200 BCE to 732, 597 the end of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, and even before that if we want to learn about the origin of this group. Fortunately, contemporary science can do that. Extract ancient DNA from non-mummified corpses of people who lived thousands of years ago, mainly from the petrous, a pyramid-shaped bone at the base of the skull that houses the inner ear components. Yet, unfortunately, only few studies that sampled ancient Israelite DNA were published to date, although additional work is underway. A significant study that met the triple requests of ancient DNA analysis and right time and place was published in 2022 by a multidisciplinary group of researchers led by Lily Tamir. Based on ancient DNA of a considerable sample, 73 individuals from Canaanite sites, half of them from Tel Megiddo, yes, this is the biblical Armageddon, and the other from other sites in nowadays Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. Most of them are dated to the late and intermediate Bronze Age, 1200 to 2300 BCE. The study that mainly focused on the Bronze Age Canaanites, which according to the Bible are the former population of the area before the Israelites, showed that they shared genetic similarity among themselves, although the samples are from different sites. What was more surprising is that the results showed that the Canaanites were a mixture of immigrant populations from the Caucasus, most likely, that is, modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, or maybe from the Zagros region, western Iran, with local Levantine Neolithic populations that stemmed from the Natufians culture. This is interesting. The Bible tells us that Abraham was an immigrant from Haran and Urpa, if you believe Cyrus Gordon. Both cities are located in southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, relatively near the Caucasus and to northwestern Zagros, and therefore might have been a transitional zone for those Bronze Age migrations. That might suggest that the story of Abraham's journey to Canaan echoes some historical truth. Moreover, a recent publication analyzed the DNA of two individuals who were found buried in the Judean site of Kiriath Yarim, somewhere between 650 BCE, the days of the kings of Ahaz, Hezekiah, or Manasseh in Judea. Their place of burial was identified as Judean from this period, based on the burial method and ceramics found in the burial cave. The DNA of those individuals that was found belongs to two haplogroups of T1A9 and H87 that may indicate on similarity of DNA to Canaanite DNA discovered in the region at sites like Late Bronze Megiddo and Alalak, and to the mixture between local and northern DNA from the Caucasus that was found typical to the Canaanite population. That might be indicated by the occurring of the descendant haplogroup T1A9A1 found in Armenia and presence of haplogroup H87 that is probably Near Eastern. With a handful of caution, this may suggest that the Israelites may have emerged as a distinct cultural group from within the Canaanite population. And there is something else that supports this hypothesis: language. Biblical or ancient Hebrew is actually a Canaanite dialect. This might be a little surprise to even native speakers of modern Israeli Hebrew like myself. If someone of this 5 million people group will bother to read an original Canaanite text like one of the Biblos, Jebel/Gval, royal inscriptions from the 10th century BCE that can be found in Wikipedia, she or he will probably be able to recognize most of the Canaanite words and even sentences with a little effort, although the somewhat different declensions and spellings. In this regard, languages tend to behave like genetic material in the basic sense that they tend to change over time and become more dissimilar over a widening distance. So, widening linguistic differences are expected for populations that once were untied and then split and became remote. By tracing changes in language phonology, which are change in pronunciation and mainly what is termed by historical linguistics sound changes, morphology, intrinsic structures of words, philology, textual meaning, and syntax, you can unfold origin of languages and maybe indirectly trace the related historical process that resulted those changes. A fascinating, well-known example is the evolution of the Indo-European languages in general and the English language in particular, described by Kevin Stroud with great talent in the first few episodes of his History of the English Language podcast. Ever since William Jones presented in 1786 notable similarities of Sanskrit to Greek and Latin, etymologists have explored the development of the vast family of Indo-European languages to the point they managed to partly reconstruct what is presumed as Proto-Indo-European, the original language, the Yamnaya culture, the people that started the great Indo-European migrations sometime between 8,000 and 4,000 BC. What enabled this fascinating linguistic reconstruction is a breakthrough of Jacob Grimm, published in 1822. He compared several Germanic languages to languages of other branches of the Indo-European language family, Latin, Sanskrit, and Greek, and formulated two systematic shifts in pronunciation, each including sound changes in which certain consonants were changed in about the same time in many words. The first occurred in second half of the first millennium BCE, when the Proto-Germanic language, the mother of Germanic languages, was presumably differed from the Proto-Indo-European, the original Indo-European language, and the second occurred in the 6th century and affected Old High German and its descendants. In a way, Grimm's law and other similar laws are parallel to Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA in population genetics. They provide us a rough time capsule that can help to trace historical changes or at least support their validation. Such systematic changes were also traced along the linguistic development that eventually resulted in archaic or biblical Hebrew. One prominent change of Canaanite from the Proto-Northwest Semitic branch is the Canaanite shift, a long A that turns into O. You can well see it by comparing the words for peace, shalom in Hebrew and salam in Arabic, which belongs to a different branch of Semitic language family. It seems that Biblical Hebrew gradually emerged within the Canaanite language as a local dialect. Hebrew and Classical Canaanite, as well as other Canaanite dialects, share vast vocabulary. For example, the word for king is mlk in both Hebrew and Phoenician, and also have close similarities in grammar and syntax. Both rely on triliteral, three-consonant roots that form the basis of word formation, use similar prefixes, suffixes, and internal vowel changes to indicate person, number, and tense. So, in a sense, Hebrew is a regional variation that evolved due to political, social, and migratory changes. Yet, when did it happen, and in what circumstances? When Hebrew became Hebrew, when did it emerge or split from the Canaanite into a dialect or language on its own? Unfortunately, those questions that might shed light on the bigger questions of Israelite origin remain an enigma. We have a missing link. Hebrew inscriptions dated the late Bronze Age still haven't been found, apart from a highly contested one that I will talk about in a future episode. The first inscriptions that are written in Hebrew, like the Gezer calendar, the Kirbet Keyafa Ostracon maybe, and the ones from Kuntilet Ajrud are dated to the 8th centuries BCE, well after the settlement period in which the Israelites settled in Canaan and emerged as a distinct ethnic and political entity. It seems that the only piece of evidence we have for this linguistic separation of Hebrew is laid in the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible. Those are songs, the Song of Deborah, the Song of Moses, also the Sea, and Psalm 68 that many biblical scholars date their core origin back to the late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE due to unique vocabulary and poetic structures that indicate on their early phase as oral traditions, like parallelism and repetitive formulas that function as mnemonics elements, supporting figures that were added to the text for helping to memorize it as an oral medium. Two historical models for tracing the origin of the Jewish people. Before we continue, here is a brief summary so far. Biblical tradition places the Israelites' origin in northern Mesopotamia, near Haran, southeast Turkey, with Abraham's family migrating from there to Canaan. Findings of genetic studies of Bronze Age Canaanites and early Judeans might coincide with the biblical narrative by indicating on mixed ancestry. Caucasus, Zagros emigrants that were dissimilated during the Bronze Age with the local Levantine population. This mixture might support the biblical tradition since Haran might be an origin or an intermediate point for those ancient Caucasus migration waves. Linguistically, Biblical Hebrew developed as a Canaanite dialect, indicating strong cultural ties to Canaanite civilization. Now, I want to take one step forward and view two interesting models that try to address the Israelite origin question more thoroughly. The first is the pastoral nomadic origin model of the archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, a leading Israeli scholar from Tel Aviv University. His model draws on an extensive body of archaeological findings including carbon-14 dating, ancient climate studies, analyses of molecular sediment of pottery and metallurgy analyses of ancient tools, archaeozoology, and more. According to this model, the Israelites were originally a pastoral nomadic group that lived in Canaan, something like a Canaanite Bedouin group, very much with accordance to the realia of the partridge stories of Genesis. So, Unlike the well-known Canaanites that were inhabitants of city-states like Ugarit, Megiddo, and Shechem, this group was almost invisible in archaeological terms. Nomadic group lives in tents or light shelters and moves around, constantly migrating, what makes them basically untraceable after hundreds and thousands of years. Also, Finkelstein assumes that the Israelites conducted trade relations with the surrounding Canaanites for completing their diet with grains. This assumption is very reasonable based on well-known patterns discovered and still evident throughout the Middle East. Nomadic and city or rural agrarian populations maintain exchange relations that often result in symbiotic relationships. The nomads buy grains and water from the agrarians in return to livestock products, meat, dairy, and wool and leather. Yet, at some point, something forced the ancient Israelites to mark up their existence and become visible to archaeology. That means to settle in permanent residence, to be villagers and shift to an agricultural lifestyle. Around a period archaeologists call Iron Orion 1150–950 BCE, there was no more grain left to sell them. A prolonged climate crisis had hit the Canaan region, as well as other vast areas in the Middle East and the Aegean region. Severe droughts, or at least dramatic decrease of precipitation, resulted in considerable decrease of grains production, and therefore the Canaanites' state city did not have excess grains to sell. And so, the Israelites became framers to supply their own grains. This transition led to the sudden appearance of hundreds of small villages dated to the Iron Orion period in East Transjordan and the highlands of the Canaan, mainly what we terms now as Judea and Sumerian or the West Bank. Finkelstein also found important evidence to the transition of the Israelites from nomads to agrarians. He traced striking similarities between the layout of ancient Israelite sites from this period, like Isbat Sarta and Beersheba, and campsite layouts of modern Bedouin populations as recorded in aerial photos in the beginning of the 20th century in the Levant. In both cases, a large courtyard surrounded by a belt of broad units may bear evidence that the inhabitants of the Iron Y sites were engaged in animal husbandry-oriented subsistence strategy. Finkelstein sees the Israelite settlement in Canaan as a part of a prolonged cyclical process, pointing to few former nomad to farmers transitions that occurred in the region before. This conceptual model has many strengths. It places the ancient Israelites' formation in a well-known anthropological processes. It is compatible with the archaeological findings and coincides with the realia of the biblical patriarch stories. The Israelites as nomads, relationships with the Canaanite cities, hangars in Canaan. Also, it presents a trigger for the Israelites' appearance on the stage of history, a climatic disaster. This is truly a compelling argument, yet it does not come without some significant drawbacks. Avoiding the obvious fact that genetics, etymology, and non-textual archaeological remains are for most part silent. They can provide only general clues about those Canaanite Israelites' potential ancestry relations. Finkelstein's and other similar hypotheses that assume that the Israelites are basically transformed Canaanites ignores significant differences between those two groups that are clearly evident both biblical and archaeological accounts. This brings us to the second model, the group synthesis model of Israel Knoll. That model differs from Finkelstein's in two basic ways. The first is methodological, or, if you are not afraid from the term, epistemological, how we know what happened, and relates to the level of trust given to the biblical text. This is a key seminal question that we will dive into in depth in our second episode. But for now, you just should be aware that the ways Knoll and Finkelstein reach their conclusion is inverse. Finkelstein, and many others, have deep doubts about the historical value of the biblical text the 8th and 7th century BCE, and so use the physical and anthropological evidence as the main raw materials of his analysis, while using the biblical text as a mere supplementary aid. Knoll, on the other hand, comes from the biblical text. He is a scholar of biblical studies, which means he studies those ancient texts for his living. His model draws on insights gathered from close examination of biblical texts with triangulation with physical evidence and texts of neighboring cultures all extinct, as the supplementary aid of proof. The second difference is substantial to the origin question. While Finkelstein see the appearance of the Israelites to be internal, from the Canaanites that lived in Canaan, Knoll see this appearance as external, as a distinct group which made through some changes and then entered Canaan from the east, in convergence with the biblical narrative. Knoll develops this model in a series of fascinating books: Where Are We From? 2008, Hashem, 2012, and How the Bible Was Born, 2018. His model is beautifully carved from analysis of biblical texts and constant triangulation of the configured assertions with other texts and archaeological evidence external to the Bible. Yet, it is important to note that with the lack of concrete direct evidence to the events other than the biblical source, we have to consider this model with caution and, at least in some cases, see it as a reasonable suggestion that without rejecting other alternative suggestions completely. Nevertheless, Knoll presents a very bold, fascinating, and innovative model that hinges on a blend of archaeological findings, Egyptian records, and a critical interpretation of the biblical text. He starts by pointing out some significant difficulties of the obvious or simple Canaanite ancestry model. According to both biblical text and archaeological evidence, there are substantial differences between the Israelites and the Canaanites in terms of religious belief. The adoption of Jehovah, originally a local deity from the peripheral region of Edom and Median, nowadays southwest Jordan and northwest Saudi Arabia, while the Canaanites had El or Baal as their head of pantheon. The Israelites also adopted early, according to the biblical source, a monotheistic belief in only one God. In contrast, the Canaanites had a full pantheon represented with specific symbols and figures like in other parts of the Levant at this period. The Israelites, also in clear contrast to the Canaanites, appeared to hold non-figurative belief. Archaeological excavations at the early villages Finkelstein mentioned from the settlement period almost never found deity figurines. However, excavations of Canaanite cities found plenty of them. And the Israelites held a strong founding narrative of the Egypt exodus the Canaanites didn't have. This array of cultural, ritual, and social differences between the Israelites and the Canaanites suggests to the other direction is pointing to. The Israelites were not transformed Canaanites, or at least that they departed for other Semitic groups in much earlier time than the settlement period. And the Israelites held a strong founding narrative of the Egypt exodus the Canaanites didn't have. This array of cultural, ritual, and social differences between the Israelites and the Canaanites suggests to the other direction is pointing to. The Israelites were not transformed Canaanites, or at least that they departed for other Semitic groups in much earlier time than the settlement period. This array of cultural, ritual, and social differences between the Israelites and the Canaanites suggests to the other direction is pointing to. The Israelites were not transformed Canaanites, or at least that they departed for other Semitic groups in much earlier time than the settlement period. Finally, findings through archaeological surveys made in West Bank and from excavations in Transjordan indicate that the broad direction of this sudden settlement boom in the Iron I period was opposite to that Finkelstein suggested in his model. According to Finkelstein's model, the Israelite settling movement should have been from the west, that is, the lowlands and coastal area where most Canaanite city-states were located to the east, the relatively unpopulated Sumerian and Judah mountainous area. Yet the actual settling direction was found to be from east to west, from the close Transjordan area east to the region of Sumerian and Judah, like the biblical source describes it. And so, because of this mixed bag of similarities to the Canaanites, language, genetics, and unique Israelite characters, Knoll suggests that the formation of the Israelites is a result of a more complicated process that took several phases. During those phases, different traditions and historical experiences blended eventually into a mutual narrative we can find in the Bible today that became the shared legacy of the Jewish people. In the manuscript of this podcast, I add a table that presents those phases according to the updated version, as I understand it, and the evidence that Knoll brings to base and justify them. In short, I divided it to 5 phases. Some of them had supposed to happen at the same time, occurred simultaneously for different Israelite subgroups in different areas. Roots, 1550-1260 BCE, 3600, 3,300 years before present, a Semitic group living in the Haran, Oran area, northern Syria/southeast Turkey, at the heart of Mitanni Kingdom. The Semitic group migrated to the Hauran, Alvern region, southeast Syria and the Golan Heights, probably after the final fall of the Mitanni Kingdom in 1260 BCE. During this phase, the group becomes a distinct people or tribe that is called Yaakov-Hel. Split. In Hauran region, the group stays under Egyptian rule and pays taxes to the Pharaonic Empire. In response to the heavy tax burden during Ramses II and Merneptah rule, many of the Yaakov-Els fled south to Edom and Median, Transjordan and northwest Saudi Arabia areas of nomads, Haviru or Shao, that did not obey to the Egyptians and did not contribute taxes to the empire. Probably at this stage or maybe later during their stay in Egypt, those Yaakov-Els adopted the local deity of the figureless Jehovah. 3a. The southern group immigrates to Egypt. The southern Yaakov-Els, or part of them, immigrate to Egypt to cope with the period of severe droughts and famine in the region, 1225–1175 BCE, probably in the last years of Ramesses' Kinu rule. They settled in the upper eastern Nile Delta, a region with concentration of Semitic population that has lived there for hundreds of years since the Hyksos rule. The Yaakov-Els are welcomed by Ramesses II, who came from a family with Semitic roots, and are employed in public works, probably in part in the new capital of Ramesses in exchange for shelter, food, and water. 3b. The northern group settles in Canaan. The northern Yaakov-Els confront Pharaoh Merneptah at the end of his famous campaign in Canaan and have success in battle. In contrast, the Egyptian record of this confrontation in the Merneptah stele. Following the victory, they enter and settle in the central mountain area, Judea and Samaria. There they settle in tribal territories as described in the Book of Judges. Probably at this phase during or before the confrontation with Merneptah, they change their name to Israel, a name that Knoll interprets as God will rule, meaning that the Israelites are no longer subjects of the Egyptian rule. 4. Egypt, struggle and exodus. Approximately 35 years after their arrival and after the death of the female pharaoh Tusret, the Yaakov-Els, Israelites, tried to take over Egypt. They were led by a dominant leader and fought the native Egyptian forces of Pharaoh Setnakhte, 20th dynasty, with their own armed forces and a mercenary reinforcement they had called from Canaan. The struggle ended in the retreat of the Israelites to Canaan, taking with them a bribe of gold and silver taken and received from Setnakhte. 5. Reunion in Canaan, the land of Israel. The southern Yaakov-Els unite with their kin, the northern and main group of Yaakov-Els that have settled in Canaan and called themselves Israel. Since they came late after the land was allocated between the northern group's tribes, they were called Levites, the ones who are accompanying or supplementing and settled all over in territories and settlements of the other tribes. As the Bible tells us, the Levites were nominated responsible for the priesthood and education of the Israelites, and in this role they bequeathed the tradition of the Egypt Exodus tradition, and maybe also the monotheistic, non-figurative belief in Jehovah to all of Israel. For those of you who want to know more on this, I placed in the transcription of this episode a table I made that describes those phases in more detail and more importantly summarizes the proofs Knoll gave for the bold claims he made at each phase. For now, I will not discuss those proofs since I expect they will be thoroughly discussed, as well as other relevant findings, in the following episodes of this podcast that will be dealing with the historical value of patriarchal age, the Egypt Exodus and the settlement, Judges Joshua period. However, it is worth to say that the Knoll model is fascinating in its scope, detailing, and extensive proof, and at least several key parts of it seem to me very compelling when considering the evidence Knoll brings to support them. Yet this model and all the other models, Finkelstein model too, remains uncertain to some degree because we don't have enough light sources, that is written evidence, to back them in the standards of modern historical studies. Instead, we are standing in what I call a state of silhouettes. We can connect a few dots that are genuine information points, certain biblical descriptions, archaeological findings, etc. Triangulate them and make claims accordingly. Until we find reliable direct sources that can back up the claims of those models, they will remain uncertain. In the current state of affairs where we have only one direct source, the Hebrew Bible, that is questionable and has some considerable problems as an historical source for all the staff before the divided kingdoms area, before approximately 900 BCE. So, before we will move on to discuss some real historical stuff considering the ancient Israelites, we will stop and to make a methodological, or if you want, epistemological stop to discuss the value of the Bible as an historical source in our next episode. I intend to cover why it is debatable, what are the difficulties it raises for historical study, and what historical value we can make of it. Going across this academic minefield we will explore here and some fundamental quotations regarding what is actually the Bible, who wrote it, different views, the historical study of the biblical period, and more. It will be fun, promise. Acknowledgement. Thank you all for listening. This episode was written by a human being, me, not an AI tool, although I used ChatGPT-4 and Grok 3 for data gathering and for some heavy-duty analyses. In those cases, I did the best I could to validate AI results with the literature. The presentation of the two models at the end of this episode was done by me according to relevant sources. The video made and dubbed with magical tools of Flicky.ai. If you like this episode, please support me on Patreon. Supporters will be able to download the subscription of this podcast with further charge.